Welcome everyone to the first installment of a new series of videos that I've been thinking about doing for a while now and have finally decided to begin. Heel or Face, where I examine the career of the spotlight wrestler of each particular entry and determine whether or not they worked better as a heel or a face. In future installments, I will allow you guys to pick who I focus on for this series, as after this video is posted, there will be a poll released on this YouTube channel and on my Twitter. The link to my Twitter, well, actually, you can see the graphic at the bottom of the screen. You'll see my Twitter handle, but the link will also be in the description where the poll will be posted. And yeah, let's keep the series going and let's get started. So I decided as a first entry, it's got to be someone difficult to really kind of sell this whole idea that I'm looking for. So I was thinking of guys like, all right, who is really good at playing both a wrestling villain and a wrestling hero? And I had a short list of guys that instantly jumped out in my mind, but at the end of the day, I decided to go with Jake the Snake Roberts, one of the icons of the golden age of wrestling during the 1980s and into the early 90s. Jake was one of my childhood favorites when I was a kid, and I think a lot of it is because, you know, this was the beginnings of the era where everything got a little bit more cartoony, a little bit more outlandish, and you got baby faces like the Tugboats of the world, like kind of goofier, the Hillbilly Jims, the Coco Bewares, kind of goofier, cartoonier type of good guys. And even someone like the Big Boss Man kind of fit into that mold a little bit. And I'm a big Boss Man fan, by the way, but feel like he's massively underrated. But Jake kind of went against that mold, and even though he had a pet snake because it was the 80s, and, you know, I guess they decided to take a page out of G.I. Joe's playbook, where a lot of the Joes have their own animal sidekicks. WWF decided to follow suit as well. Coco had the parrot, the British Bulldogs had Matilda the Bulldog, and Jake the Snake had my favorite animal sidekick, Damien the Python. So even with kind of like on paper, the animal sidekick thing is kind of silly, with Jake it fit perfectly, and a snake is inherently like a creepy animal to begin with, but is also really cool. So it was kind of like this weird, like, kind of Jake made you feel uneasy, but you also wanted to watch him because he was so inherently cool, and I think Damien added to that as well. And the interesting thing about Jake, when he first went to the company, he started as a heel, and there's the famous story with they wanted to work him with Hogan, and when they did the Snake Pit segment where he DDT'd Hogan, that was going to kick off their program, the crowd was split, and they decided not to go in that direction and find another opponent for Hogan, and ultimately turn Jake babyface. And if you watch Jake Roberts' stuff in 1986, like the latter half of 86, watch his match with Randy Savage from Saturday Night's Main Event, which is essentially a heel versus heel match. The crowd is starting to come on Jake's side, because Jake, again, he was kind of a cool character, and there's, I think the fans wanted to like him. So he transitioned from a heel to a face, a move that I feel personally extended Jake Roberts' career. If you see him in interviews, Jake laments not being able to work the program with Hogan and making the big bucks. But I would argue, had he done that program with Hogan, there's a real good chance he would have been chewed up, spat out like every other heel that worked with Hogan, and Jake's run would have been cut short, because once he gets destroyed by Hogan, what do you do with that? I think as a babyface, it allowed Jake to have a longer run, and at various points, he was the number 3, maybe even number 2 babyface on the roster at times, and usually had some of the best programs. You look at his feud with Rick Rude, his feud with DiBiase over the $1 Million Championship belt, the blinding angle with Rick Martel, which led to the blindfold match at WrestleMania 7, which I say to this day, I will defend that match. I think it's a classic. I love that match, and represents wrestling theater and wrestlers as magicians, getting the most out of the least, using the little tricks that they need to make a very limiting match work. I think that match is brilliant, and I think it's the best match of Jake Roberts' career. The defining match of Jake Roberts' career that highlighted all of his strengths as a worker. But, he also had the brief feud with Earthquake, where Earthquake killed Damien, which broke my heart as a kid, because I loved Damien so much. But Jake was an amazing storyteller with his promos, especially to sell all of these feuds and all of these angles. And I talked about this in some of my live streams that I did, where I talk about old pay-per-views and old shows. Jake Roberts' promo became a bit of a WrestleMania tradition. If you look at WrestleMania 6, 7, and 8, the promos that Jake cuts on each of those events are downright perfect. And one of the reasons I love Jake on the stick so much is that he's not a ranting, raving lunatic, because in the 80s, everybody was a ranting, raving lunatic, and we love him. Like Randy Savage, love his promos. Hulk Hogan, love his promos. Ultimate Warrior, god damn it, I couldn't understand him, but I loved him anyway. Jake Roberts was a completely different cat, and he would actually almost whisper the way, and it helps that his voice sounded really cool anyway, but he would almost whisper and almost force you to have to pay attention to him by not being overly forceful with his promos, but everything he said could sting it. One line that he said in particular at WrestleMania 8, he was going over footage of when he and The Undertaker had their falling out, and he DDT'd Paul Bearer on the floor, and he said, "Ooh, short ride, bad landing." And that's a line that I've used a ton of times because it's such a great line. And Jake was full of those little moments and making a lot of little things matter just through speaking and making his matches seem a lot bigger as a result. So I think Jake worked amazingly well as a babyface for the WWF. But then when he turned heel in '92 and did the program with Randy Savage, he became like the best villain in the world, doing the Trust Me gimmick and working with The Undertaker as his partner, and the stuff he did with Ultimate Warrior, which was over the top and insane. But when he broke up Randy Savage's and Miss Elizabeth's wedding reception and ruined the party for them, and that infamous snakebite angle where he turned a king cobra on Randy Savage and had him legit as a shoot bite him, one of the craziest and most villainous things I've ever seen. And he was, as good as he was as a face, he became one of the greatest villains overnight for the company. And it was amazing at how well he was able to turn on a dime like that and play that heel persona so well. And this is probably the creepiest that Jake ever was at any other point in his career. So really with Jake, you almost have to look at his WWF stuff to really get a true sense of what he was like as a talent. Yes, he had worked in other territories prior to going to WWF, but I think WWF is where he became a fully fleshed out, fully realized character, complete with the snake, and his promos were at their very best, even down to the design of his tights, everything that they did to making that character so iconic. A lot of that came in the WWF, and he also got 2 runs as a heel and a big run as hit the biggest run of his career as a babyface. So there's a lot to judge there, and as I've kind of laid out here in my explanation of Jake Roberts' WWF run, he was excellent as both a face and a heel and knew how to make both roles work perfectly. And even down to how he executed the finisher, where as a babyface, his matches were worked around hitting the DDT and making the fans want to see the DDT, and then he would hit the DDT and the crowd would pop. The DDT, probably my favorite finisher of the 1980s, ultimately evolved into something even grander with when Diamond Dallas Page, a friend of Jake's, brought out and developed the Diamond Cutter, which is kind of the DDT of the 90s, the way that Diamond Dallas Page was able to execute that. But when he was a face, he would use the DDT that way, make the fans anticipate seeing the DDT, and work the entire match around that. As a heel, he would kind of hit it out of nowhere. Like, I think back to his the Saturday Night's Main Event match with Savage in '92, where he took advantage of a mistake that Savage made and then hit the DDT real quick. And it's like, oh my God, it's over. Or look at his match with Undertaker at WrestleMania 8. He countered the tombstone, flipped around, hit the DDT out of nowhere, completely out of nowhere, and used it as a momentum switch to kind of completely cut off the babyface and possibly even win the match. So the DDT was used very effectively either way. But again, it also shows one of the things that everybody says about Jake Roberts, and it's absolutely true, he's a master of in-ring psychology and making sure that everything he does is done so in line with his character and to make his feuds and his storylines mean as much as they possibly can. I think back, the Royal Rumble match that a lot of people say is the greatest Royal Rumble match of all time is the 1992 edition, ultimately won by Ric Flair. But go watch Jake Roberts during that match. There's a lot of little things that he does. One thing that I noticed is that while he's in the ring, whenever the buzzer sounds to bring out a new entrant, he would look at the entryway to see, because he knows that Randy Savage is coming out and they're in the middle of a blood feud. And so he's anticipating and waiting for Randy Savage to come out and have that big clash. And little things like that Jake would do that would really set him apart from everybody else. And I think he thinks of a lot of little things that I think even back then, a lot of the workers maybe didn't always consider. Like, I put over the blindfold match at WrestleMania 7. How many blindfold matches are good? There aren't many. Usually those matches are kind of a stinker, but Jake made it work because Jake knew how to make it work. And he made it work by inviting crowd participation and, and also Rick Martel being kind of the clown of the match, and you get a lot of comedy out of that. But I think back on Jake, and as a face, he could get you excited. He could get you completely on his side, and he could be sympathetic. You look at the storyline where Rick Martel blinded him. That was something like very off-putting in a sense. They had him wear the whited out contact lens to highlight that he was blinded, which is not really how that works. But whatever. It was as far as portraying it on television, it worked through the visual medium. But I remember the segment where they laid him back and they were like working on his eyes. They showed doctors kind of working on his eyes and examining him and everything. And Jake was like, I just want to see. And that was a great sympathy getter for Jake. And probably the best example of that is when Earthquake killed Damien, which if you go back and watch the segment now, you can tell that they switched the bags underneath the ring, and it wasn't really Damien in the bag, thank God. But Jake's reaction to that completely sold that moment. And he basically, as upset as every kid was, like myself, that Damien had just been killed by Earthquake, Jake's reaction to it made it all the more worse, because he was downright in tears over it, because it was his companion, it was his trusted ally in the ring, and his pet and everything else. So he completely sold that moment perfectly. So Jake Roberts is an absolutely excellent babyface, and it's not because he's a cookie cutter good guy. If anything, he's a little rough around the edges. And actually, you compare the Rock and Wrestling era to the Attitude Era, not many characters in the Rock and Wrestling era would fit in the Attitude Era without major changes. Jake Roberts is one of the few who, if you had put Jake in his prime in 1998, he still would have worked, I think, as a babyface, because again, he was a little rough around the edges. He didn't have the chiseled, athletic look, but he was very creepy and is almost mesmerizing, the type of presence that he had, and he was just very, very cool. And head and shoulders above most of the other baby faces that were around at the time. But on the other side, him as a heel, you couldn't find a more dastardly villain than him. This guy actually slapped Miss Elizabeth in the face. That's a thing this guy did. And you hurt Miss Elizabeth back in those days, you are an absolute, complete, hateable piece of garbage, and I want nothing to do with you. And again, another example of how Jake Roberts could be a master. As a heel, he knew how to get people to hate him. And I remember I attended a house show. It was actually my first live event ever, my first wrestling event ever. Or I'm sorry, it was my second wrestling event ever. My first one was in 91. That was the one where I saw Andre for the first and only time. But the second event, one of the main event, actually, the closing match, it was Randy Savage versus Jake Roberts in a steel cage match. And let me tell you, and not all of my memory of that night is completely intact. There are some matches and outcomes that I've forgotten. One thing I do remember, that crowd was way into Randy Savage, and they did not like Jake. So he did his job effectively, and the crowd reacted accordingly to who was the heel and who was the babyface. So Jake could be as evil and as sinister as any heel possibly could be. And he started off as a really good heel too. I think back to WrestleMania 2 where he wrapped the snake around poor George Wells and he started foaming at the mouth and everything. So he was a really dangerous, scary kind of character when he first came on board. But the fan reaction to him, I think, shifted them into making him a babyface. But we have several runs of Jake being a great heel, but there's that stuff in the middle, like the bulk of his run in the company where he was a really great babyface. And this is a very, very hard call, probably one of the hardest calls I'll ever have to do. But if I had to pick how I prefer Jake Roberts, whether it be a face or a heel, I'm going to say face. And that has nothing to do with Jake's inability as a heel, because like I said, not many heels are as good as Jake Roberts, especially in 91 and 92 when he did his stuff with Randy Savage. But when I think of Jake and I look back on his career, the stuff that stands out to me the most are his run as a babyface. And when it came to gaining sympathy, getting me on his side, making me care about all of his feuds and all of his storylines and all of his matches, Jake Roberts did that to absolute perfection and was easily one of the most likable and easy to get behind babyfaces in the company, because he didn't fit in with that Hulk Hogan mold. He didn't fit in with that Ultimate Warrior type of character. He wasn't a larger-than-life superhero, and he wasn't a cartoony goody two-shoes like a Hillbilly Jim or a Typhoon. He wasn't one of those guys. He was the realest dude in the room. Like, you actually believed that this guy just went home at night and just hung around with snakes all day. He had that type of vibe and that type of personality to him. So Jake is, without a doubt, one of the best baby faces of that era. And despite the fact that he's an excellent heel, as far as deciding how I prefer Jake Roberts, I'd much rather like him than I would hate him. So to me, absolutely, without a doubt, despite a very difficult internal debate in my mind, I ultimately like Jake Roberts more as a babyface, because he did go against the mold of what other babyfaces at the time were supposed to be doing and prove that it could absolutely work, because he was absolutely great at that. So that concludes my first episode of Heel or Face. There will be more of those. Like I said, I will be posting a poll on this YouTube channel and on my Twitter account. The link is in the description. Also, you can see the little graphic there so you know what my Twitter handle is. And if you want to see more videos from me and get up-to-date information on what is going on with this channel, you can follow me on Twitter. And be sure to like, subscribe, hit the little bell icon so you get notified when I post new videos. But that is all I have for you right now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I will see you all later.